They told you Africa had no history, no kingdoms, no written knowledge, no monuments worth remembering. They taught that civilization was a gift the Western world brought to a dark and empty continent. They lied. Beneath the sands of Sudan, behind the jungles of West Africa, buried under the stone plains of Zimbabwe, and etched into the oral traditions of Zulu warriors, they are kingdoms that rivaled anything Europe ever built. And for centuries, the most powerful institutions on Earth worked systematically to make sure you never found out. This is not myth. This is not speculation. This is documented history, sourced, verified, and deliberately suppressed. Tonight, 5 forgotten empires reclaim their place in the record. History is not written by the defeated. It is written by whoever holds the pen after the battle ends. And for more than 400 years, Africa's pen was held by someone else. Welcome. What you are about to hear is not comfortable. It will challenge textbooks, contradict documentaries you have already watched, and name the specific mechanisms by which some of the greatest human civilizations in recorded history were erased from global memory. Every fact in this account is sourced. Every claim is documented. The suppression itself is a matter of public record. If this story matters to you, and it should matter to every human being alive today, subscribe to this channel now. Turn on notifications, because the algorithm buries this kind of content, and the only way it survives is if you choose to carry it. Tonight, 5 kingdoms, 5 dark truths, and one overarching conspiracy of erasure that spans 4 continents and 6 centuries. We begin in the Nile Valley, 35 centuries ago, with an empire so powerful it conquered Egypt and was then expunged from Egyptian history entirely. In 750 BCE, a Nubian king named Pi marched his army north from the Kingdom of Kush, what is today northern Sudan, and conquered Egypt. Not a border raid, not a regional skirmish, a full conquest. He captured city after city along the Nile, received the surrender of regional rulers, and was crowned pharaoh of all Egypt. Kush ruled the most powerful civilization on Earth. This became known as the 25th dynasty. The dynasty Egyptologists spent over a century referring to as a foreign intrusion, a footnote, a parenthesis in the real story of Egypt. What they struggled to say plainly was this: the Black African Kingdom of Kush had ruled Egypt for nearly a century, and the pharaohs of that era, Pi, Shabaka, Taharqa, were among the most accomplished rulers in Egyptian history. Taharqa alone is referenced in the Bible, in Assyrian military records, and in Greek accounts as one of the most formidable kings of the ancient Near East. He restored temples, expanded the empire, and commanded armies that fought the Assyrian emperor Esarhaddon to a standstill, twice. It was only on the Third Assyrian invasion in 663 BCE that Kush was pushed back into its Nubian heartland. What happened next is the dark truth. The Assyrians destroyed the Egyptian city of Thebes. The political vacuum they left was eventually filled by a new Egyptian dynasty, one with strong motivation to distance itself from its Kushite predecessors. Over subsequent centuries, Kushite monuments were defaced, inscriptions altered, and the historical record of Nubian rule over Egypt was buried under layers of revisionist stonework. When European Egyptologists arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries, they inherited that revised record. They then compounded it. Scholars including the influential Count de Volney had already noted the African features of Egyptian monuments as early as 1787, but the academic establishment that followed chose a different interpretation. Statues of Taharqa and other Kushite pharaohs were catalogued as Egyptian, stripped of their Nubian context, and absorbed into a narrative that had no room for a sub-Saharan African empire ruling the ancient world. Meanwhile, Kush itself continued for another 1,000 years after its retreat from Egypt. Its capital, Meroe, became one of the ancient world's leading iron-smelting centers. Meroitic iron technology spread across sub-Saharan Africa. The kingdom developed its own writing script, Meroitic, which remains only partially deciphered. It traded with Rome, with Arabia, with India, and it produced more pyramids in Egypt. There are approximately 200 to 255 pyramids in Sudan today, compared to 138 in Egypt. Most people do not know they exist. The Kingdom of Kush did not fall into obscurity because it was insignificant. It fell into obscurity because the story of Black African civilization at the center of the ancient world was inconvenient to the narrative being constructed in Europe. That is not an allegation. That is a pattern documented by scholars including Bruce Trigger, Laszlo Turek, and Timothy Kendall across decades of peer-reviewed archaeological work. In 1324 CE, a man left the city of Mali with 60,000 men, 12,000 slaves, each carrying 4 pounds of gold, and 80 camels loaded with gold dust. His name was Mansa Musa. He was the emperor of the Mali Empire, and his pilgrimage to Mecca that year caused an economic catastrophe in the Mediterranean world from which Egypt did not fully recover for 12 years. Musa distributed gold so liberally along his route, through Cairo, through the Levant, through the trading cities of North Africa, that he single-handedly devalued gold across the region. The price of gold in Egypt collapsed. Merchants who had dealt in the metal for generations were ruined overnight. A contemporary Arab historian named al-Umari, writing in Cairo about 10 years after Musa's passage, recorded that the city was still recovering. This is documented, this is sourced, this is real. Mansa Musa is today estimated by economic historians to have been the wealthiest individual in human history in inflation-adjusted terms. Estimates of his net worth range from $400 billion to $415 billion in modern values. He ruled an empire that covered modern-day Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, and parts of Niger and Burkina Faso. His territory was roughly 2 million square kilometers, larger than Western Europe. The Mali Empire's wealth rested on its control of the trans-Saharan gold and salt trade routes. Gold from the mines of Bambouk and Bure passed northward through Mali to the Mediterranean world. Salt moved south. The empire taxed both. Its cities grew into centers of Islamic scholarship, commerce, and administration that had no parallel in sub-Saharan Africa and few rivals anywhere on Earth. Timbuktu was not a remote outpost. At its height in the late 15th century, under the successor Songhai Empire that grew from Mali's foundations, Timbuktu Songor Mosque functioned as a university with an enrollment estimated at 25,000 students. The city held between 700,000 and 1 million manuscripts, texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, history, and Islamic theology, preserved in private libraries by families who understood their value. Many of those manuscripts still exist today, though a significant number were destroyed or looted during the 2012 Islamic occupation of the city. The dark truth of the Mali Empire is two-layered. The first layer is the familiar one, the deliberate omission of West African civilizational achievement from the standard historical curriculum taught in Europe and its former colonies. The second layer is more specific and more devastating. In 1591, a Moroccan army armed with gunpowder weapons crossed the Sahara and invaded the Songhai Empire, Mali's successor state. At the Battle of Tondibi, one of the largest cavalry forces in African history, numbering approximately 40,000 men, charged a Moroccan force of roughly 4,000 soldiers equipped with arquebuses and cannons. The Songhai cavalry was annihilated. It was one of the first decisive demonstrations in African history of what firearms would mean for the continent's political future. The Moroccans captured Timbuktu, looted its libraries, and deported its scholars to Marrakesh. The institutional knowledge of an entire civilization was physically removed. The manuscripts that survived did so because ordinary families hid them in walls and cellars and beneath floors, where some remained undiscovered until the 21st century. In southeastern Africa, in what is today the nation of Zimbabwe, there stands a complex of stone structures so precisely engineered that early European visitors declared they could not have been built by Africans. The walls of Great Zimbabwe rise up to 11 meters in height and extend for 250 meters. They were constructed without mortar, using a technique called dry stone walling, granite blocks shaped and fitted together with such precision that the walls have stood for 8 centuries and remain structurally sound today. Great Zimbabwe was the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, the dominant state of the Shona-speaking people of the interior plateau between approximately 1100 and 1450 CE. At its height, the city held an estimated 10,000 to 18,000 inhabitants.
It was the center of a trade network that connected the African interior to the Swahili coast and through it to Arabia, Persia, India, and China. Archaeologists have excavated Chinese porcelain, Persian faience, and Arabian glass beads from its ruins. Great Zimbabwe was not isolated, it was cosmopolitan. Its economy was built on cattle, agriculture, and above all, gold. The kingdom controlled the gold trade of the interior plateau, channeling metal to the port of Sofala on the Indian Ocean, where it entered the wider Asian trade system. This is not speculation. The Portuguese, who arrived on the East African coast in the early 16th century, documented the trade routes and the source of the gold explicitly. The documentary evidence was available in European archives for centuries. And yet, when the ruins of Great Zimbabwe were formally investigated by European scholars beginning in the 1870s, the conclusion reached and aggressively promoted was that Africans could not have built them. The German explorer Karl Mauch, who visited the site in 1871, declared the structures were built by Phoenicians or by the biblical Queen of Sheba. A series of subsequent investigators promoted similar theories involving ancient Arabs, ancient Israelites, and other non-African builders.
The dark truth is that this was not merely academic error, it became deliberate policy. When the archaeologist David Randall McIver conducted a rigorous excavation in 1905 and concluded unequivocally that the ruins were of medieval African origin, the colonial establishment in Rhodesia, the colonial name for Zimbabwe, rejected his findings. When Gertrude Caton Thompson confirmed his conclusions with even more extensive excavation in 1929, she faced sustained professional hostility. Under the government of Ian Smith's Rhodesia in the 1960s and 1970s, it was effectively illegal to publish or broadcast the conclusion that Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous Africans. A government censor reviewed publications on the subject. Guides at the site were instructed to avoid affirming African authorship. This censorship lasted until Zimbabwe's independence in 1980. The suppression of this particular historical truth was not metaphorical. It was written into law. The Kingdom of Dahomey occupied what is now the southern part of the Republic of Benin. It was founded in the early 17th century and grew into one of the most militarily organized states in West African history. At its core was an institution that had no parallel anywhere in the world, the Agoji, an all-female regiment of the Royal Army, trained from childhood, bound by oath, and feared by every neighboring kingdom. The Agoji, sometimes called the Dahomey Amazons by European observers, numbered between 1,000 and 6,000 at their peak. They were recruited from the king's wives, from convicted criminals, from orphans, and from volunteers. Their training was exceptionally harsh by any standard of the era. They underwent physical conditioning that European military observers who witnessed them described as superior to that of male soldiers they had seen anywhere. French Foreign Legion veterans who fought against the Agoji in the 1890s recorded their ferocity and tactical effectiveness with genuine alarm. Dahomey's military machine sustained a state that was, by regional standards, extremely sophisticated. It had a centralized bureaucracy, a standing army, formal taxation, and a system of census-taking that recorded the population by household. It maintained diplomatic relationships with European powers, including Britain, Portugal, and France. Its kings received European ambassadors in formal court ceremonies documented in detail by the visitors themselves. Now comes the dark truth, the one that neither the African pride narrative nor the colonial guilt narrative wants to hold at the same time. The Kingdom of Dahomey was a primary and systematic participant in the Atlantic slave trade. This is not contested. It is documented in Dahomeyan royal records, in European trading company accounts, in Portuguese naval logs, and in the testimony of survivors transported to the Americas. Dahomey raided neighboring kingdoms, the Yoruba, the Mahi, the Uida, took prisoners of war and sold them to European slave traders at the port of Uida on the Gulf of Guinea. The kingdom's economy depended on this trade for more than a century. Estimates suggest that Dahomey sold between 10,000 and 20,000 enslaved people annually at the height of the trade. The royal treasury was substantially funded by it. The Agoji participated in the raids that produced those captives. This history is suppressed from two directions simultaneously. Colonial European historiography suppressed the military sophistication and state organization of Dahomey because it contradicted the narrative of African primitiveness used to justify colonialism. Post-colonial African national historiography sometimes suppressed Dahomey's role in the slave trade because it complicated the narrative of Africa as purely victim, rather than also in specific contexts as agent of that catastrophe.
The Kingdom of Dahomey fell to France in two wars, 1890 and 1892 to 1894. In the First Franco-Dahomeyan War, Dahomey held French forces to a negotiated withdrawal. In the second, French forces under General Alfred Amédée Dodds, himself of partial African descent, deployed artillery and superior numbers to defeat the Dahomean army in a series of engagements. King Béhanzine was captured, exiled first to Martinique and then to Algeria, where he died in 1906. The Agouji were disbanded. Their history was officially classified as folklore. In the early 19th century, a military commander named Shaka Kasenzangakona inherited leadership of a minor Nguni clan in what is now KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Within 12 years, he had built the most formidable military force in the history of sub-Saharan Africa and forged the Zulu nation from a collection of chiefdoms stretching across tens of thousands of square kilometers. Shaka's innovations were not simply tactical, they were systemic. He replaced the long throwing spear with a shorter, broader stabbing weapon, the Ikwa, designed for close combat. He trained his regiments, called Amabuto, to close the distance with an enemy at a run, deny them the opportunity to reload ranged weapons, and fight at a range where discipline and physical conditioning determined the outcome. His famous encircling formation, the bullhorn, divided enemy forces, surrounded them, and destroyed them in detail. It was not a primitive tactic, it was a sophisticated operational concept that military historians continue to analyze. The dark truth of the Zulu nation arrived on the morning of 22 January 1879 at a rocky outcrop called Isandwana in present-day KwaZulu-Natal. A British imperial force of approximately 1,800 men, regulars of the 24th Regiment of Foot and colonial auxiliaries, was attacked by a Zulu army of approximately 20,000 warriors. In less than 2 hours, roughly 1,300 British and Allied soldiers were dead. It remains one of the worst defeats in the history of the British Army, and the worst suffered by British forces at the hands of an indigenous force during the entire colonial period. The British response was immediate and total. Within days, the government in London authorized massive reinforcements. Within months, the full weight of the Victorian military machine, Gatling guns, artillery, tens of thousands of soldiers, was deployed against the Zulu kingdom. By July 1879, the Zulu capital of Ulundi was burned and King Chitswayo was captured. The kingdom was formally annexed.
The propaganda war that followed Isandwana was as important as the military campaign. British newspapers and official dispatches worked urgently to reframe the Zulu victory not as evidence of sophisticated military organization and tactical genius, but as a surprise attack by savages against unprepared soldiers. The competence of the Zulu command structure, the discipline of its regiments, and the strategic intelligence of its operational planning were systematically downplayed in public accounts. What could not be denied was buried in the technical language of military reports that the general public never read. 5 kingdoms, 5 civilizations, 5 cases in which the documented historical record was suppressed, distorted, or buried, not by accident, not through the innocent passage of time, but through deliberate institutional action by governments, academic establishments, and colonial administrations that understood exactly what they were doing and why. Kush was written out of Egyptology. Mali was written out of financial history. Great Zimbabwe was subjected to legal censorship. Dahomey was simplified into either a warrior fantasy or a slave-trading footnote, depending on who was telling the story. And the Zulu nation, which handed the most powerful empire on earth one of its most humiliating military defeats, was repackaged as a minor colonial inconvenience. The common thread is not incompetence. The common thread is not the natural fog of historical distance. The common thread is power, and the understood threat that these stories pose to the narratives that justified conquest, extraction, and the global racial hierarchy that the colonial project required. Knowing this history does not rewrite the present, but it changes the frame through which the present is understood. Every assumption about which civilizations mattered, which cultures produced knowledge, which peoples were capable of governing themselves, those assumptions have a history. That history was manufactured, and manufactured things can be corrected. If this account has changed something in how you see the world, share it. Not for this channel, for the kingdoms. Every view is an empire remembered. Every share is a library that does not burn. Subscribe now if you have not. Leave a comment with the kingdom that surprised you most. And if you believe history belongs to everyone, not just to whoever held the pen, then stay, because the next story is darker still, and it has not been told yet.